The news that came out of the Gaza Strip was horrifying even for a region long accustomed to conflict and suffering. It was a story of a place of healing turned into a scene of carnage. An Israeli military strike hit Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, the largest functioning medical facility in the besieged territory. This was not a single, isolated explosion. Minutes after the first missile slammed into the building, a second one followed. This brutal tactic is known as a double-tap strike. It is designed to maximize casualties, hitting the very people who rush in to help the wounded after an initial attack. The context for this tragedy is the long and bitter conflict that has engulfed this narrow strip of land. Journalists from around the globe flock to Gaza to bear witness. They document events and give a voice to those caught in the crossfire. They know the risks are immense. They wear vests marked press. They wear helmets marked press. Not as a guarantee of safety, but as a plea for it. They are civilians, and under international law they are protected. But in war, those laws are too often broken. On this devastating day, the hospital was not just a sanctuary for the sick and injured, it was also a makeshift base for the press. Journalists gathered there, seeking the relative safety of a known civilian location, and using its upper floors to catch a precious signal for their equipment. They needed to transmit their reports. They needed to send their photos. They needed to send their videos out to news organizations across the world. They were doing their job, telling the story of the war from one of the few places they believed they could operate from. This belief would prove to be tragically mistaken, turning their workplace into a tomb. The final toll was staggering and deeply personal for the media community. At least 20 people were killed, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. It began around 10 in the morning, a time when the day's news cycle is just beginning to take shape. The first missile, reportedly fired from a drone, struck the fourth floor of a building within the Nasser Hospital complex. Eyewitness accounts suggest this location was no accident. It was a known gathering spot for journalists. This was the area where they could get a reliable signal for their eSIM cards and satellite phones. One journalist, Hussam al-Masri, a cameraman for the Reuters news agency, was right there, operating a live camera with a view of nearby military positions when the blast hit. The initial explosion created instant chaos. The sound ripped through the hospital grounds. Smoke and debris filled the air. People screamed and ran for cover. Inside, medical staff were already overwhelmed by the daily toll of the war. Now, the war had come directly to their doorstep. The first strike claimed its first victim. Survivors say its true purpose was far more sinister. Bait. It drew people into a pre-selected kill zone. Instinct to help took over. Rescue workers in bright orange vests stationed nearby ran toward the danger. Fellow journalists, seeing one of their own go down, grabbed their cameras and rushed in. Their job is to document, to capture the immediate aftermath, to show the world. They moved up the external staircase toward the smoldering fourth floor, filming rescue efforts and assessing the damage. They were now in the open, exposed. In those few frantic minutes between strikes, the area flooded with first responders and members of the press. They were a mix of cameramen, photographers, and reporters converging on the hit spot. They were not combatants, they were helpers and storytellers. Many wore protective gear labeled press or paramedic. They didn't know they were walking into a trap, and a second more powerful missile was already on its way, aimed directly at them. Just moments after the first responders and journalists arrived, the second missile hit. This one, fired from a tank, slammed into the very same spot as the first. The impact was devastating. It tore through the cluster of people who had gathered to help, turning a rescue mission into a massacre. The force of the explosion was immense. Those caught in the blast had no chance. The external staircase they had used to climb toward the scene was now a twisted wreck, the air filled with the cries of the wounded and the horrifying silence of the dead. It was a calculated, deadly strike on helpers. The journalists who died were there because it was their duty. Mohammed Salama, a cameraman for Al Jazeera, Hussam al-Masri, contractor for Reuters, hit in the initial blast. Mariam Abu Daga worked with the Associated Press and other agencies. Moth Abu Taha, freelance journalist. Ahmed Abu Aziz, freelance journalist. They were not just names on a casualty list, they were respected professionals, the eyes and ears for millions who relied on them to understand the reality of the war. They died holding their cameras, their tools for telling the truth. This type of double-tap attack is condemned under international humanitarian law because it deliberately targets civilians and rescuers. It is a tactic that not only kills but also terrorizes. It sends a chilling message to anyone who might rush to the aid of the wounded. You could be next. For emergency crews, it makes an already dangerous job nearly impossible. For journalists, it turns reporting into a life-or-death gamble. The attack on Nasser Hospital showed how protections can evaporate in the heat of conflict, leaving civilians tragically vulnerable. The aftermath was a scene of unbelievable horror. The rescuers had become the victims. The journalists who came to report had become the story. Their colleagues who survived were left to film the bodies of their friends, their cameras capturing a grief that was deeply personal. This incident highlighted the extreme dangers of reporting from a war zone where lines between combatant and civilian are deliberately blurred. It was a direct hit on the people whose job is to ensure that war crimes do not go undocumented. The news of the double strike on Nasser Hospital and the killing of 5 journalists sent shockwaves of outrage across the globe. Press freedom organizations were, unequivocal in their condemnation. The Foreign Press Association said it was, outraged and in shock, calling the attack one of the deadliest on journalists since the war began. These groups exist to defend the right of reporters to work without fear of being targeted. This incident was seen as a grave assault on that fundamental principle, a deliberate act to silence the press. Major news organizations expressed profound sorrow. Reuters, the Associated Press, they mourned the loss of their colleagues and questioned Israel's ability to conduct a credible investigation into its own military's actions. In a powerful statement, they pointed to a pattern where past inquiries rarely resulted in clarity or accountability. They raised the terrifying possibility that live media feeds were being deliberately targeted in an effort to suppress information and control what the world is allowed to see. The Israeli government's response came from the top. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the incident, conceding that journalists and first responders had been killed. He referred to their deaths as a tragic mishap. This explanation was met with widespread skepticism and anger. For the families of the victims and for press advocacy groups, calling a precision double-tap strike on a known media location a mishap was, honestly, wholly inadequate. It felt like an attempt to dismiss the gravity of an attack that appeared to be intentional and targeted, aimed directly at those documenting the conflict. The international community watched closely. Global leaders and human rights organizations called for a full and transparent investigation. The killing of journalists is considered a very serious matter because it is an attack on more than just individuals. It is an attack on the public's right to know. When reporters are silenced, bullets, bombs, intimidation, the first casualty is the truth. Without their courageous work, the world is left with only propaganda and official statements. The demand for accountability grew louder, a chorus of voices insisting that this mishap not be forgotten. The deliberate killing of journalists in a conflict zone is truly one of the gravest offenses against freedom. Reporters are not soldiers, they are civilians who venture into chaos to find clarity.